Alright, so what we are going to do is we are actually going to take a look at a typical nerve pathway just as a form of review. So a typical nerve pathway starts with our stimulus, which can be anything like light, heat, smell, temperature, anything along those lines. That stimulus is picked up by a receptor, and typically these are our sense organs, our eyes, our ears, even our skin. We'll be taking a closer look at these receptors in a separate unit from the nervous system. I think we have enough to handle here with just the nervous system itself. The receptor then sends the message about the stimulus to our sensory neuron. Its job is to carry those impulses to the central nervous system, but keep in mind it is a part of only the peripheral nervous system. The sensory neuron then sends its information to an interneuron. These are located within the central nervous system of the brain and the spinal cord, and their job is to relay messages as well as process and analyze information. So interneurons make up most of the area in the processing centers of the brain. The interneuron then sends its message to a motor neuron. Motor neurons are part of the peripheral nervous system, and their job is to carry the impulse from the central nervous system to the effector. Now, this grouping of a sensory neuron sending a message to an interneuron, which sends the message to the motor neuron, is the nerve pathway. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to contrast this nerve pathway with the reflex arc, which is slightly different. But the motor neuron has one more place to send its impulse, and that is to the effector. Remember, that is a muscle or gland, and its job is to respond to the stimulus. So now that we've reviewed this typical nerve pathway, let's go ahead and look at reflexes. A reflex is simply one way that the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system interact with each other. A reflex is an automatic motor response to a very specific stimulus. With a reflex, we get the same response every time. Now, reflexes are used as a survival mechanism, and so oftentimes the response that is generated opposes or undoes the effects of the stimulus. So this is a form of negative feedback. Reflexes do not involve the processing centers of the brain. In fact, many reflexes don't get any processing at all. If there is any processing done by interneurons, the interneurons are actually only contained within the spinal cord. Now we have two main types. We actually have three that we'll look at, but one is contained in a video clip. But the two main types that we'll look at in our notes here. The first one is a simple reflex, and sometimes the wiring of the simple reflex is referred to as the reflex arc. So we have 5 steps in a simple reflex: stimulus arrival and receptor activation, the sensory neuron activation, information processing by an interneuron. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second and just say that sometimes step 3 is missing completely. It just depends on the type of simple reflex arc you're discussing. We'll actually take a look at one where it is typically missing. And remember, if there is an interneuron present, it's only present in the spinal cord. We then get motor neuron activation, and finally the response. Now, within the type of simple reflexes we can have something called a monosynaptic reflex. This is where there's only one synapse involved. In other words, the only synapse that is involved is between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So there's no interneuron. This is the most rapid type of reflex that we have. An example of a simple monosynaptic reflex is your stretch reflexes. This causes your muscles to contract to counteract a stretch. And as we stand or sit, this is actually what helps to maintain our normal posture and balance. I actually like to use the demonstration, for instance, of standing on one foot. Your foot kind of wiggles a little bit at the ankle, and that's because of reflexes that are actually helping to check your balance. Another stretch reflex that you're very familiar with is the knee jerk. And this type of stretch reflex can be used to test the condition of your spinal cord, your peripheral nerves, and your muscle. Now, with the knee jerk reflex, what happens is we apply a short stimulus to the patellar tendon. What that does is it stretches that patellar tendon and causes the quadricep muscle to contract to produce that noticeable kick. Now, in this video clip that I do have posted on the website, they talk more about the reflex. They also look at the pupillary reflex, which is another great simple reflex, but they also demonstrate the patellar reflex as well. At the end of the video clip, the students actually have a car with bright lights that actually shines on them. And they very quickly turn and kind of put their hands up to shield their eyes from that. And that is actually an example of a complex reflex. A complex reflex is sometimes called a polysynaptic reflex because we have more than one synapse present. In a complex reflex, we have at least one interneuron between the sensory and motor neurons. These types of reflexes are slower than the simple ones, but they're more involved. So the turning away from the bright light is a great example because not only do they have to react with their eyes, squinting, turning of the head, they also have to put up their arm. This includes our withdrawal reflexes, where we move our stimulated parts of the body away from a particular stimulus. One of the types of withdrawal reflexes we have is a flexor reflex, and what it does is it affects the muscles of a limb. So we're going to go through an example of this. This would be grabbing a hot pan. When we grab a hot pan, our pain receptors get stimulated, which activate the sensory, then the and then the motor neurons, and then the message goes to our arm to flex our biceps, which pulls our hand away. These oftentimes are the reflexes that kind of cause you to jump like, ooh, and pull your arm away, or your leg away, or your foot up. Those are the types of reflexes that we're probably most familiar with. Now, on the website, there is a video clip about comparing the simple reflex to something called a conditioned reflex, and I do suggest that you watch that. In the video, they talk about a hockey goalie, and they talk about a hockey goalie having good reflexes. What they're talking about, though, is not a true reflex, because true reflexes are actually inborn in us. Conditioned reflexes are things that are voluntary and learned and can improve over time with practice, whereas a simple reflex is involuntary, automatic, very rapid, and the same every single time. So it is important to make that distinction simply because we do tend to discuss reflexes in that matter. All right, but as we do go through life, some of our reflexes do modify themselves. As we get older and grow from infancy, spinal reflexes actually get inhibited as we make more descending fibers connections in our spinal cord. So in other words, if you think about us when we are born, we can't walk, but our legs function. As those descending fibers get created and those connections get made, some of those connections actually inhibit some of our reflexes. So we can see these sorts of things happen in us as humans as we develop from infancy. And the example I want to use is the Babinski Reflex. If your pediatrician tests for the Babinski Reflex, they typically take like the handle of the stretch reflex hammer, and they'll run it from the heel up towards the toes on the sole of your foot. If you have the Babinski Reflex in a young infant, usually no more than about 3 to 6 months of age, the baby will actually fan their toes. It's not that it tickles, that's actually a reflex that they are looking for. Now, as we get older, this reflex actually disappears, and that's actually something we want to see. We want to see that get inhibited as we get older. If we were to perform this test on you or I, what we should see instead of the Babinski reflex is the plantar reflex. And this is when we perform that same action, but instead of fanning the toes, we actually curl them in. Now, doctors continue to test this reflex because if the Babinski reflex were for some reason to reappear, it is a sign of some sort of central nervous system injury that they would want to take a look at. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our segments here on neurons, nerve pathways, and some of the different ways that our bodies actually react, including reflexes. The rest of the unit is actually going to look more specifically at the central nervous system, including the spinal cord, the brain, and their processes that are associated with them.